When doctors opened her body in 1558, they found actual teeth embedded in a mass the size of a baby. What they discovered next made experienced physicians flee the room in horror. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly what this thing was and why the truth was buried for over 4 centuries. What if I told you that human teeth were growing inside Queen Mary I's abdomen, embedded in a mass that doctors initially mistook for a child? November 17, 1558, at St. James's Palace, 3 royal physicians stood frozen over their queen's opened body, staring at something that defied every medical text they'd ever studied. Dr. George Owen, Mary's personal physician for years, had seen countless dissections, performed autopsies on plague victims, treated battlefield wounds that would make modern surgeons sick. But nothing prepared him for what lay inside his queen. There, occupying nearly her entire abdominal cavity, was a growth the size of a full-term infant. Dark, irregular, pulsating with decay, even in death. And protruding from its surface, clearly visible in the flickering candlelight, were teeth. Actual human teeth. Not 1 or 2, but multiple formations, some fully formed with roots, others partially emerged like a child's first teeth breaking through gums. Dr. Thomas Wendy, who'd been banned from court years earlier for suggesting Mary wasn't actually pregnant, felt a cold vindication mixed with pure horror. He'd known something was catastrophically wrong, but this exceeded his darkest theories. The third physician, a younger man whose name has been deliberately erased from records, made a choking sound and stumbled backward from the table. The teeth weren't randomly scattered. They formed in clusters, organized in ways that suggested intention, as if something inside Mary had been trying to create a mouth. Some were molars, thick and grinding. Others were incisors, sharp and predatory. Dr. Owen reached out with trembling hands and touched one of the formations. It was solid, rooted deep into the tissue of the mass, as real as the teeth in his own mouth. But that wasn't all. As they carefully examined the growth, running their hands over its grotesque surface, they discovered other structures. Strands of hair, coarse and dark, sprouting from sections of the tumor. Areas that felt distinctly like bone beneath the diseased tissue, hard and calcified in patterns that mimicked a ribcage or skull fragments. One section had a texture that Dr. Wendy would later describe in his private notes as resembling skin, complete with pores and what might have been sweat glands. The mass had been attempting to create human body parts, but without any organization or purpose. A nightmare of biological confusion. Mary had been carrying this thing for years, feeling it move inside her, believing it was England's heir. The irony was devastating. Her body had been trying to create life, but it had manifested as this monstrous parody of human development. The smell that filled the chamber wasn't the typical odor of recent death. It was decay from within, a putrid stench that suggested the tumor had been dying and rotting while Mary was still alive. Parts of it had necrotized months or even years ago, black and liquefied, while other sections continued growing with horrible vitality. Dr. Owen ordered the windows opened, but the November air did little to clear the overwhelming reek of corruption. One of the attending servants who'd been allowed in to assist with moving the body took one look at what the physicians had uncovered and vomited violently into the corner. The man was removed and reportedly never spoke again, traumatized into permanent silence by what he'd witnessed. The physicians knew immediately that what they were seeing could never be made public. Protestant enemies across Europe were already celebrating Mary's death, calling it divine judgment for her persecution of heretics. If they learned that the Catholic queen had died with teeth growing inside her womb, the propaganda would be catastrophic. But the discovery raised a question more disturbing than any political consideration. If this thing had teeth, if it had been trying to form human features, what exactly had Mary been feeling all those months when she swore she felt her baby moving? The human body contains cells called germ cells, and they're more powerful than most people realize. These cells, found in ovaries and testes, carry the complete genetic blueprint to create an entire human being. Every organ, every tissue, every structure from brain to bone to teeth. Under normal circumstances, these cells only activate during reproduction, combining with another person's genetic material to form an embryo. But sometimes, rarely, catastrophically, a germ cell activates on its own. It starts trying to create a human body without fertilization, without a partner's DNA, without any of the normal regulatory signals that control development. What results is called a teratoma, from the Greek word teraton, meaning monster. And monster is precisely what the Tudor physicians were looking at inside Mary's body. This wasn't cancer in the traditional sense, though it could become malignant. It was Mary's own cells attempting to build a human being, and failing in the most grotesque way imaginable. The germ cell had received signals, possibly from hormonal changes, stress, or random cellular chaos, that triggered its developmental programming. It began dividing, creating tissue, forming structures, but without the complex orchestration that occurs during normal pregnancy, the result was biological anarchy. Teratomas grow teeth more frequently than any other structure because tooth formation is one of the earliest and most fundamental developmental processes. Even in proper human development, teeth begin forming in the womb long before a baby is born. The genetic switches that triggered tooth development are ancient, coded deep in our DNA from evolutionary ancestors. When a confused germ cell starts its chaotic attempt at creating a body, tooth formation often kicks in first because those genetic pathways are so accessible and fundamental. The tumor inside Mary had triggered these pathways repeatedly. Modern medical literature documents teratomas containing dozens of teeth, some cases with over 100 individual tooth formations. But teeth weren't the limit of what these tumors could create. In the centuries since Mary's death, doctors have found teratomas containing fully formed eyes, complete with retinas and optic nerves. Brain tissue capable of producing detectable brain waves, fingers and toes with nails attached, sections of intestine, liver, lung tissue, hair follicles producing thick growths of hair, patches of skin with functioning sweat and oil glands, even, in extremely rare cases, partial faces with recognizable features. The tumor inside Mary I was likely trying to create all of these things. The physicians noted hair and bone-like structures. Given the size of the mass, estimated at 8 to 12 pounds, based on the swelling Mary exhibited, there were almost certainly other partially formed organs and tissues buried deeper inside. Here's what makes this even more disturbing from a biological standpoint. The tumor was using Mary's body as a resource, drawing nutrients from her bloodstream, hijacking her hormonal systems, essentially treating her as a host organism for its chaotic growth. As it expanded, the mass produced human chorionic gonadotropin, the same hormone a developing embryo produces during actual pregnancy. Mary's body detected this hormone and responded exactly as it should during pregnancy. Her breasts swelled and became tender, preparing to produce milk. Her menstrual cycle stopped. She experienced morning sickness as her body adjusted to what it perceived as pregnancy hormones. The exhaustion, the emotional changes, the physical symptoms that convinced everyone, including trained physicians, that she was carrying a child. All of it was real. The tumor had essentially hacked Mary's reproductive system, creating a false pregnancy so convincing that it fooled the queen herself and everyone around her. For months, Mary felt sensations she interpreted as her baby moving. The quickening, that moment when a pregnant woman first feels the child inside her kick and shift. What she was actually feeling was the tumor growing, pressing against her organs, shifting position as it expanded within the confined space of her abdomen. April 1554. Mary stood before her court and announced with tearful joy that she was pregnant with England's heir. She was 38 years old, recently married to Philip II of Spain, desperate for a child that would secure Catholic succession and prevent her Protestant half-sister Elizabeth from ever taking the throne. The announcement sent shockwaves across Europe. Church bells rang throughout London. Foreign ambassadors dispatched urgent letters to their governments. Mary commissioned elaborate cradles, hired wet nurses, ordered christening gowns embroidered with gold thread. She spent hours in her private chapel praying for a healthy son, convinced that God had finally blessed her reign. Her belly began to swell, growing noticeably larger week by week. Physicians examined her and confirmed what seemed obvious. The queen was pregnant. Due date calculations were made. The baby should arrive in late May or early June of 1555. But what was actually happening inside Mary's body was far more sinister. The tumor, possibly present in a small form for years, had suddenly accelerated its growth. The stress of marriage, the desperate desire for a child, hormonal changes from her relationship with Philip, all of these factors may have triggered the germ cells to activate more aggressively. The mass began expanding rapidly, doubling in size, then doubling again. As the tumor grew, it started producing massive amounts of pregnancy hormones. Mary's body responded with textbook pregnancy symptoms. She vomited frequently in the early months. Her breasts became enlarged and tender. She gained weight in her face and arms as her body prepared for the demands of nursing a child. Court observers noted that she seemed to glow with maternal happiness. Her mood transformed from the bitter, frustrated woman who'd spent years fighting to claim her throne. She made plans for her child's education, debated names with her ladies in waiting, discussed which nobles would serve as godparents. Everything seemed to be progressing exactly as a pregnancy should, except for one detail that some of her closer attendants noticed but dared not mention. The swelling of Mary's belly was asymmetrical. Most pregnant women develop a rounded, even shape as the baby grows. Mary's abdomen was larger on the right side, bulging irregularly as if something inside her wasn't positioned correctly. One lady-in-waiting, whose name has been lost to history, later confided to her family that touching the queen's belly felt wrong. Instead of the soft, yielding sensation of a pregnant woman's stomach, Mary's abdomen felt hard and immovable, almost rock-like in certain areas. The lady-in-waiting mentioned this concern to a senior midwife who examined the queen and reported that everything seemed normal. The midwife lied. She'd felt the same wrongness but knew that contradicting the queen's belief that she was pregnant could result in execution for treason. May 1555 arrived. No baby. June came and went. Still no baby. Mary remained in her birthing chamber at Hampton Court Palace, surrounded by midwives and attendants, insisting that she felt movement, that the child was simply not ready yet. 2 months past her due date, the rumors began spreading throughout London. Something was catastrophically wrong with the Queen. The Spanish ambassador wrote increasingly confused letters to Philip, who'd left England and showed no interest in returning. By August, even Mary could no longer deny reality. There was no baby. There had never been a baby. The humiliation was total and devastating. Pamphlets circulated across Europe mocking the Catholic Queen. Protestant enemies claimed God had cursed her barren womb as punishment for burning heretics. Mary withdrew from public view, crushed by shame and grief. But the tumor inside her hadn't gone anywhere. It remained lodged in her abdomen, still producing hormones, still growing slowly. And 18 months later, it would trigger an even more horrifying repeat of the phantom pregnancy. But this time, the symptoms would be so extreme that everyone, including Mary herself, would know something was terribly, horribly wrong. The second phantom pregnancy would be the tumor's final growth phase, the period when it would expand to its maximum size and begin actively killing its host. By 1556, Mary's body had become a battleground between her desperate desire for a child and the monstrous growth slowly consuming her from the inside. When she announced her second pregnancy, barely 18 months after the first humiliation, the reaction was drastically different. Instead of celebration, there was skepticism and barely concealed concern. Foreign ambassadors reported that the Queen seemed almost manic, claiming with fevered insistence that this time it was real, that God had finally answered her prayers. But what was actually happening inside Mary's body was biological horror, on a scale that would have terrified even the most experienced physicians if they'd fully understood it. The tumor had entered an aggressive growth phase. Within weeks of her announcement, Mary's belly swelled to enormous proportions, far larger than any normal pregnancy. Court observers noted that she looked further along than women at full term, her abdomen grotesquely distended and stretched tight like a drum. Something was definitely inside her, causing dramatic swelling. But the nature of that something was becoming impossible to ignore. The pain started soon after. Sharp, stabbing sensations that left Mary doubled over and crying out in agony. This wasn't the discomfort of pregnancy. This was the pain of a massive tumor pressing against organs, stretching tissue beyond its limits, competing for space with her intestines, liver, and kidneys. Mary's attendants watched in growing horror as their queen's body transformed in ways that defied natural pregnancy. Her face became gaunt and aged, her eyes sunken and fevered. Her arms and legs grew thin as she lost weight everywhere except her belly, which continued expanding at an alarming rate. She looked like a woman in the final stages of starvation, except for that enormous hard protrusion that seemed completely disconnected from the rest of her deteriorating frame. The tumor had grown so large that it affected her balance. Mary needed attendants to support her when she walked, because the mass threw off her center of gravity. She moved like a woman twice her age, hunched and shuffling, every step clearly causing pain. Her appetite vanished. Food seemed to aggravate whatever was inside her, causing violent cramping and nausea that left her vomiting for hours. The tumor was pressing against her stomach, literally leaving no room for food. What little she managed to eat provided nutrients that the tumor absorbed, feeding its growth while Mary's body wasted away. One of her ladies-in-waiting described the horror of helping the Queen dress. Mary's belly had stretched so dramatically that her skin appeared translucent, veins visible beneath the surface. In certain lighting, you could see movement beneath the skin as the tumor shifted position, pressing against the abdominal wall. The sensations Mary described became increasingly disturbing as the second phantom pregnancy progressed. She would wake screaming in the night, claiming she felt something wrong inside her, something moving in ways that didn't feel like a baby. The movements were slow and irregular, not the quick kicks and rolls that pregnant women typically experience. It felt, she told her attendants, like something was unfolding inside her, expanding and contracting in ways that caused sharp, tearing pain. What she was actually feeling was the tumor's continued growth. As it expanded, it put pressure on surrounding organs, shifted position within her abdominal cavity, and stretched tissue that was never meant to accommodate such a massive foreign presence. The teeth embedded in the tumor's surface may have pressed against internal structures, creating sensations of scraping and catching that Mary interpreted as wrong movement. The hair growing from sections of the tumor may have created unusual textures that her body registered as foreign and threatening. Modern medical understanding of teratomas reveals that they can continue growing throughout a patient's life if left untreated. The tumor inside Mary had likely been present since her 20s or early 30s, growing slowly for years. The stress and hormonal changes of her first pregnancy announcement may have triggered accelerated growth. By the second phantom pregnancy, the tumor had reached massive proportions and entered a terminal phase where its expansion would inevitably kill its host. And through all of this, Mary clung desperately to the belief that she was carrying England's heir. When Dr. George Owen and his colleagues opened Mary's body on November 17, 1558, they weren't just conducting a medical examination. They were uncovering evidence of a biological nightmare that had been consuming the Queen for years. The speed and secrecy of the autopsy was unprecedented. Royal autopsies were extremely rare in Tudor England, reserved only for suspicious deaths or when political necessity demanded proof of cause. Yet here were the Queen's own doctors, insisting with unusual urgency that they needed to examine what was inside her before the body was prepared for burial. They locked the doors to her private chambers. They posted guards outside with orders to admit no one. They worked by candlelight in complete secrecy, knowing that what they were about to discover could have political ramifications that extended far beyond medicine. The first incision released an odor so overwhelming that one of the attending servants fled the room. It wasn't the normal smell of a recently deceased body. This was decay from inside, a putrid stench that suggested tissue had been dying and rotting while Mary was still alive. As they peeled back layers of skin and muscle exposing the abdominal cavity, every physician in that room understood that they were witnessing something beyond their medical training, something that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The mass occupied nearly Mary's entire abdomen. It had grown so large that her other organs had been compressed and displaced, pushed aside by the tumor's relentless expansion. Her intestines were bunched and flattened against her spine. Her liver showed signs of pressure damage. Her kidneys were compromised, which explained the yellowish tinge her skin had taken in her final months. But it was the tumor itself that made the physicians freeze in shock. Dark, almost black in places, with areas of obvious necrosis where tissue had died and begun to decompose. The surface was irregular and lumpy, studded with formations that caught the candlelight. As Dr. Owen leaned closer, his hand trembling as he held the light, he saw them clearly. Teeth. Multiple teeth embedded in the surface of the mass, some fully formed with visible roots, others partially emerged like a grotesque parody of a child's first teeth. Dr. Wendy, standing beside him, reached out and touched one of the tooth formations. It was solid, real, rooted deep into the tumor's tissue. He pulled his hand back as if burned, staring at his fingers as if expecting them to be corrupted by what he touched. The younger physician made a sound somewhere between a sob and a gasp. He would leave London that very night, abandoning his position at court without explanation, taking what he'd witnessed to an early grave. But the teeth were just the beginning. As the doctors carefully examined the mass, they discovered other structures that defied explanation. Strands of hair, dark and coarse, growing from multiple points on the tumor's surface. Some sections were covered in what appeared to be skin, complete with pores and the texture of human flesh. Beneath the surface, they felt hard structures that could only be bone, calcified formations that had no business existing inside a woman's abdomen. Dr. Owen made detailed notes, his handwriting becoming increasingly erratic as the examination progressed. He documented the size of the mass, estimated at 10 to 12 pounds based on the displacement of organs and the swelling Mary had exhibited. He noted the locations of tooth formations, counted at least 8 clearly visible teeth with possibly more buried deeper in the tissue. He described the hair as similar to scalp hair, thick and dark, growing in patches across the tumor's surface. His notes mentioned bone-like structures beneath the surface, hardness that suggested ribs or skull fragments forming within the mass. But there were some things he saw that night that he couldn't bring himself to write down. Details too disturbing, too likely to be misconstrued as signs of demonic possession or divine judgment. The partial formations that might have been fingers. The section that looked disturbingly like an eye socket. The areas where tissue had organized itself into patterns that suggested organ development, a kidney or lung that never fully formed. The biological explanation for what the Tudor physicians witnessed is simultaneously more understandable and more disturbing than any supernatural cause. Teratomas form when germ cells, the cells designed to create new life, malfunction and begin developing without fertilization. These cells contain the complete genetic code for building an entire human body. Under normal circumstances, they remain dormant until reproduction occurs. But various triggers can cause them to activate inappropriately. Hormonal imbalances, genetic mutations, cellular trauma, or even random chance can flip the switch that tells a germ cell to start developing. Once activated, the cell begins dividing and differentiating, creating specialized tissues just like a proper embryo would. But without the complex regulatory systems that guide normal fetal development, the process becomes chaotic. The cell doesn't receive signals about where it is or what it should be creating. It just starts making human body parts. Teeth form, because tooth development is one of the most basic and earliest developmental processes. The genetic pathways for creating teeth are ancient and fundamental. Hair grows because follicle formation is similarly basic. Bone calcifies because skeletal development is essential. Eyes attempt to form because vision is a priority developmental pathway. But nothing connects properly. Nothing serves a purpose. It's just random human tissue growing in complete disorganization. Modern medical literature has documented teratomas containing fully formed structures that seem impossible. There are cases of tumors with complete eyes, perfectly formed with corneas, lenses, and retinas capable of detecting light. Teratomas with brain tissue that produces measurable electrical activity on EEG monitors, suggesting some form of neural function, despite having no consciousness or awareness. Tumors containing fingers and toes with nails, complete hand structures with bones and joints, sections of spine with individual vertebrae properly formed and articulated. One particularly disturbing case in Japan involved a teratoma containing a partial face with recognizable features including a nose, part of a mouth with teeth, and what appeared to be an ear structure. The tumor had no consciousness, no awareness, no life in any meaningful sense. But it had created these features with remarkable accuracy, following the genetic blueprint for building a human face despite having no context or purpose. The tumor inside Mary I likely contained structures beyond what the Tudor physicians could recognize or document. Without modern medical knowledge, they had no framework for understanding what they were seeing. They knew teeth and hair, they could recognize bone. But partially formed organs, proto-fingers, sections of developing brain tissue, all of these would have appeared as unidentifiable masses to doctors trained in 16th century medicine. The philosophical and psychological horror of Mary's situation becomes clear when you understand that the tumor was made from her own genetic material. This wasn't a foreign invader or demonic possession. It was Mary's body, using her DNA, attempting to create life. In a twisted, nightmarish way, her body was trying to fulfill her desperate desire for a child. The germ cells that formed the tumor contained half of the genetic information needed to create a baby. Under normal circumstances, those cells would combine with male genetic material during fertilization. But something triggered them to activate alone, to attempt creation without a partner's DNA. What resulted was a biological catastrophe, a chaotic attempt at creating human life that produced only horror. Every tooth in that tumor was made from Mary's genetic code. Every strand of hair followed her DNA blueprint. The bone formations, the partial organs, the structures that tried and failed to become human features, all of it was fundamentally Mary. She had been carrying a grotesque version of herself, a failed child made from her own cells. The irony is devastating. Mary wanted a baby more than anything. She prayed for it, believed God would grant her an heir, felt pregnancy symptoms and interpreted them as divine blessing. And in a sense, her body was trying to give her what she wanted. But without proper fertilization, without the genetic contribution from a father, the result could only be monstrous. The moment the Tudor physicians understood what they'd discovered, they faced an impossible decision. The truth about Mary's death was more than just medically significant. It was politically explosive. England in 1558 was deeply divided along religious lines. Mary had spent her 5-year reign violently enforcing Catholic orthodoxy, burning Protestant heretics, trying to drag England back under papal authority. Her death marked the end of Catholic rule and the beginning of Elizabeth's Protestant reign. If Protestant enemies learned that the Catholic queen had died with teeth and hair growing inside her womb, the propaganda would be catastrophic and uncontrollable. Pamphlets would claim it was divine judgment, proof that God had cursed Mary's body for her persecution of true believers. They would say the tumor was physical evidence of the evil inside her, that her barren womb had sprouted corruption instead of children because she was fundamentally wicked. The Catholic cause in England, already weakened by Mary's death, would be irreparably damaged. Foreign Catholic powers would be humiliated. The Spanish alliance would collapse. Everything Mary had fought for would be destroyed, not by her political decisions, but by the biological nightmare that had been consuming her from the inside. So Dr. Owen and his colleagues made a choice that would stand for over 4 centuries. They would bury the truth along with Mary's body. The cover-up began immediately. Dr. Owen's detailed notes were seized by counselors before he'd even left the examination chamber. Any physician who'd been present was called into a private meeting and given explicit instructions. They were to speak to no one about what they had seen. The official report would list Mary's cause of death as influenza complicated by dropsy, a vague diagnosis that explained her swelling and decline without revealing the true horror. No mention of the tumor, no description of the teeth or hair or bone formations. Nothing that could be weaponized by Protestant propagandists or used to undermine Catholic credibility. The physicians were warned that discussing the autopsy findings would be considered treason punishable by death. Several were given generous pensions and sent far from London, effectively bought off and exiled where they couldn't accidentally let the truth slip. One doctor who'd assisted in the examination disappeared entirely from historical records after that night. His name was struck from court documents. His family later claimed he'd died of sudden fever, but no death certificate exists. Modern historians suspect he may have been silenced permanently to ensure his absolute silence. Another physician, the young man who'd fled the room in horror, died within months under suspicious circumstances. Mary's burial was rushed compared to other monarchs. She died on November 17th and was interred by December 14th, less than a month later. Normal royal funerals involved extended mourning periods, elaborate ceremonies, lying in state for weeks to allow subjects to pay respects. Mary's body was prepared quickly and sealed in a lead coffin, before most of the kingdom even knew she'd died. Lead coffins were expensive but served a crucial purpose beyond preserving remains. Lead created an airtight seal that prevented decay and, more importantly for Mary's counselors, made future exhumation nearly impossible. Whatever physical evidence existed of the tumor, of the teeth and hair and bone formations that had horrified the examining physicians, was locked away where it could never be accessed without massive effort and official sanction. The coffin was placed in Westminster Abbey, in a vault that would later also contain Elizabeth. The location was deliberately chosen. Westminster Abbey was sacred ground, protected by the church. Any attempt to disturb the tomb would require approval from both religious and political authorities. The likelihood of anyone ever opening that coffin was minimal. Mary's secret would stay buried in lead and stone, hidden beneath one of England's most holy sites, protected by layers of tradition and sanctity that made examination impossible. More than 4 centuries after Mary's death, her body still lies undisturbed in Westminster Abbey. The lead coffin sealed in 1558 has never been opened. Modern technology could solve every remaining mystery about what killed Mary I. Ground-penetrating radar could map the contents of the coffin without opening it. Advanced imaging could confirm the presence of the tumor, possibly even identify remaining calcified structures like teeth or bone formations. Non-invasive analysis could determine exactly what type of teratoma killed her, how large it had grown, how long it had been developing. We could finally confirm the horrifying details that Tudor physicians witnessed by candlelight and took to their graves, but Westminster Abbey has consistently refused all requests to examine Mary's tomb. The official reason is respect for the dead, preservation of sacred spaces, the principle that royal remains should not be disturbed for scientific curiosity. But some historians wonder if there's another reason. If the truth about Bloody Mary's body is still too disturbing, too politically sensitive, even after 400 years. The church has the technology. The resources exist. Medical historians have made compelling arguments for why examination would be valuable. Yet every request is denied. The tomb remains sealed. The secret stays buried. Modern medical diagnosis, based on Mary's documented symptoms and the Tudor physician's descriptions, points to a massive ovarian teratoma that became malignant. This type of tumor, called a mature cystic teratoma or dermoid cyst when benign, commonly contains teeth, hair, and bone. They form from germ cells in the ovaries and can grow to enormous sizes if left untreated. In Mary's case, the tumor likely began as a small growth in her 20s or early 30s. It grew slowly for years, causing minimal symptoms until hormonal changes or stress triggered accelerated development. The first phantom pregnancy in 1554 was probably the tumor reaching a size where it caused visible abdominal swelling and began producing enough hormones to mimic pregnancy. The second phantom pregnancy in 1556 was the tumor entering its terminal growth phase, expanding to 10 or 12 pounds and beginning to cause organ failure. Modern survival rates for advanced ovarian teratomas, even with surgery and chemotherapy, are grim. If the tumor has spread to surrounding organs and grown to massive size, 5-year survival rates drop below 30%. Mary survived approximately 3 to 4 years from when the tumor became large enough to cause symptoms until her death. She did so without any effective treatment, driven by sheer willpower and desperate hope that she would live to see a Catholic heir secured. The final months of Mary's life must have been unimaginable agony. The tumor pressing against her organs, competing for space with her intestines, stomach, and lungs. Unable to eat because there was no room for food. Unable to breathe properly because the mass pushed up against her diaphragm. Every movement causing pain as the tumor shifted and scraped against internal structures. And through it all, knowing that she had failed. No heir, no child, no Catholic succession. Everything she'd fought for would die with her, and her Protestant half-sister would inherit the throne. Mary's story is tragic on every level. A woman desperate for a child, experiencing real pregnancy symptoms, believing God was answering her prayers, while actually dying from a tumor that was trying to create human life from her own genetic material, but failing catastrophically. The teeth that grew inside her womb were her DNA attempting to form a baby without the means to do so. The hair and bone were her body's confused attempt at creation. And the horror that Tudor physicians witnessed that November night was the physical manifestation of a biological process gone impossibly wrong. That truth is still down there, sealed in lead beneath Westminster Abbey, waiting for the day someone finally demands to know what was really inside Bloody Mary. If this video disturbed you as much as it should, you need to subscribe right now, because we're the only channel pulling back the curtain on historical horrors that institutions have buried for centuries. These aren't sanitized history lessons. These are the real, visceral truths that powerful people decided you weren't ready to know. Hit that subscribe button, and you'll be first to see the next revelation that's been hidden in vaults and sealed tombs. Drop a comment telling us whether Westminster Abbey should finally open Mary's coffin and let modern science examine what's inside. Your comment pushes this video to more people who deserve the uncensored truth about history's darkest secrets. And smash that like button if you believe 400 years of cover-up is long enough. Every like tells the algorithm to show this to more truth seekers. We're building a community that refuses to accept the official story, and you're part of it now. Don't let this be the last time you hear history without the lies.